Okay, so I'm going to anthroposophical meetings, and nobody seems to be talking about the implications of the ideas in the philosophy of freedom and in theory of knowledge implicit in Goethe's world conception. And I think I've told this story earlier about going to a meeting with Owen Barfield in 86 or 87 in Fair Oaks, where he said, the Theory of Knowledge was the least read, most important book Steiner ever wrote, which confirmed for me, again from Barfield, my interest in it. And then I ended up back in San Francisco for a couple of years in 97, after I'd spent a while in New England in the Wilton Limeboro area, and I was working for this guy, the disabled professor of American history, and I started going to study groups over in Berkeley that I'd gone to before. I was going to groups at Marion Herman Rubach's, and also I was going into some social studies, social science studies work at Annie Bianchi's in Berkeley. And I still had the same problem. People weren't talking about this stuff. So when time came for me to write about, to not be able to go to Ann Arbor in 1997, I sent this essay ahead of me. I said, well, I'll try to contribute this way. And as I wrote the essay, I tried to work out, in a much more simple form than I was able to do later when I looked at things. It's not as sophisticated, but the basic ideas are there, in which I came to the conclusion that when people sit around and talk about the lecture cycles, we're making epistemological errors. We're asleep to the relationship between the process by which we form concepts about what we read from Steiner and what that means for whether we have a belief, understanding, or knowledge. And at that time I talked about it the best way I could. Okay? Now that's the story of that line of development, which of course matured and became other things later on. But that's my problem. That's the epistemological swampland of the anthroposophical movement, which is people go to meetings and have discussions and carry on all this stuff. And since hardly anybody's really achieved what's possible through the philosophy of freedom, nobody's able to stand in the world and say, there are certain cognitive consequences from understanding this set of relationships in the mind between thinking and concept and experience. And so you don't hear Dornack talking about it. You don't hear the Vorstan talking about it. You don't hear the councils in America talking about it. And as a consequence, things live in the anthroposophical society that people maybe wouldn't want to have lived there. And it's very sad in a way, But I also think if you really survey it in the right way, if you really think about it without getting too stressed out by the fact, then you eventually come to, as I did, the last time I went to this sort of thinking about the whole total situation, when I wrote my book, my essay, Saving Anthroposophy from the Anthroposophical Society and Movement, I said we're involved in the problem of incarnating anthroposophy, and it's not something that's going to have happened in the first 100 years. It's too difficult. It's hard for human beings to really appreciate what they're trying to do. So in producing this work on real anthroposophy, I'm just trying to say, time to slide over into these basic things that we kind of skipped by. Okay? Now, let's talk about anthroposophy, the Anthroposophical Society, whether it's a living social form, okay? Well, that was the second essay in my outline Anthroposophy. I'm kind of trying to make it show up here on this other computer screen. I've got two computer screens when I'm doing this, okay? I've got just to the side here, out of sight, my laptop. And then over there, I got my tower. Okay? So this allows me to refer to things when I need to refer to things. Okay? So, anyway. I wrote the epistemological swampland thing first, and then I wrote is the society a living form? And I simply asked the question, what makes a social form living? What are the processes? Well, a social form arises as a consequence of the activity of the participants in the form. It can't be something they aren't. Which is one of the flaws in thinking about the Christmas conference the way people do today, as if it's some kind of magical thing that makes anthroposophy this wonderful thing in the world. It's just lame thinking that lets you get to that point of view, and it doesn't really work. Okay, so we have anthroposophy, the anthroposophical societies, we have the branches and the movements, and what makes something living as a social form. And that time I really couldn't answer that, but I was able to think about the processes that we were engaged in when we were in these groups, when we talked to each other. And it was pretty clear to me that what came out of the mouths of people into this social form was something dead. That as every time people went into their memory and pulled out of the dust heap of their memory something Steiner said, which idea about, they had no conception of how they formed the idea. They were asleep to the process by which they brought that in the first place, and they added it to the conversation. They actually killed the life element that was potential in that social environment by constantly bringing dead thought to it. That was one aspect of why it wasn't a living social form. The other one was the deification of Rudolf Steiner. Branches and study groups, at least the ones I observed, and I never really saw any evidence this was otherwise, what was the nature or the quality or the effect of us deifying Rudolf Steiner, of putting him up here and ourselves down here, so that our own cognitive activity doesn't participate. And we go around and we worship Rudolf Steiner and we make him this big deal. And there's no original thinking out of our own eye, no lively thinking entering into the social form. So how can it be alive? I came to the conclusion that it was constantly being killed by us introducing Steiner said all the time, and also constantly being killed by the fact that we basically turned it into a house of worship of Rudolf Steiner, instead of a place where we were trying to understand ourselves and each other and who we were and what that was about. Okay? So, that was the consequence of outline anthroposophy, those kinds of ideas, and of course, when they showed up in Ann Arbor in 1997, it was subversive. Nobody ever asked the question, was it true? Which is the only important question if you're going to practice real anthroposophy.